Good morning, and welcome to the FNN's Years in Review. I'm Natalie Hedden.
And I'm Jessica Montone, reporting on the major events that happened in the years 1854 to 1856. Before we begin, here's a word from our sponsor. For all your clothing needs, come to the Ferris Wheel Cotton Industry, located on Washington Avenue. Open from 12 to 6.
Breaking news, the Kansas-Nebraska Act has just been passed. On December 14, 1853, Augustus C. Dodge of Iowa introduced a bill in the Senate proposing organization of the Nebraska Territory. Chaired by Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the Committee of Territories received this bill. Douglas is an ardent sponsor of Manifest Destiny, the idea that the United States has the God-given right and obligation to take over as much land as possible and to spread its civilizing influence. Organizing Nebraska will require the removal of the territory's Native Americans because Douglas considers the Indians as savages and views their reservations as, quote, barriers of barbarianism, end quote. Basically, Douglas believes Manifest Destiny entails the removal of those who stand in the way of American Christian progress. Douglas needed to propose a bill for organizing Nebraska, Kansas, which stated that the slavery question would be decided by popular sovereignty. This bill would repeal the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which said that slavery could not extend above the 3630 line, ultimately opening up the North to slavery. A clause insisted be added by Congress. It is quite obvious that the North is outraged and the South is ecstatic. Douglas received Pierce's approval and pushed his bill through Congress, regardless of the anger of his own party. On this day, May 30th, 1854, the bill has become a law. The final bill declared the Missouri Compromise as, quote-unquote, inoperative and void. Support for this law comes from the Southern Whigs and the Democrats and the votes of half of the Northern Democratic members of Congress. The biggest question now is why Douglas risked reviving the slavery question, which had so adamantly been kept quiet in Congress. His critics believe that his chief interest is to win nomination for future involvement in the government, such as presidential election. It is also believed that he is trying to secure a right-of-way for transcontinental railroad that would make Chicago the country's transportation hub. His admirers defended him by stating that if he had not championed the bill, someone else would have. It is now feared that this bill could lead to civil conflict and even war.
Over the recent events that have taken place in Kansas, we have two commentators, Hannah Smith and Jason Martin, voicing their opinions regarding Bleeding Kansas.
Over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Jess and Natalie. Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here today to share my northern views on Bleeding Kansas. After the Compromise of 1850, which I'd strongly disliked, I'd hoped that at least the slavery controversy would end, but it turned out to be the calm before the storm. On December 14, 1853, Augustus C. Douglas had proposed a bill in Congress that would organize the Nebraska Territory. This bill was also known as a Committee of Territories. Douglas had hoped that he would create the dream of Manifest Destiny, to take over as much land as possible, thus expanding westward. In order to get the votes he needed, he had to please the Southerners. This really frustrated my fellow Northerners and I. This influenced him to allow the Kansas-Nebraska Act to be decided by popular sovereignty. I was outraged. If this bill were passed, the anti-slavery line of 3630 would be eliminated, making it legal for Southerners to bring their slaves into the North, and this simply was not okay. On May 30th, 1854, this bill became active. I was furious. Nebraska was extremely far north, which led me to believe that it wouldn't be a problem, although Kansas was located right next to Missouri, and that era would soon to become known as Bleeding Kansas. Kansas became the battleground over the slavery question. The Northern, myself included, had a quick reaction. Eli Thayer organized the New England Immigrant Aid Company, which sent Northerners like myself to Kansas to secure as a free state. By the summer of 1855, approximately 1,200 New Englanders had moved from Kansas to fight for freedom. Henry Ward Beecher aided them by giving them Sharp rifles or Beecher Bibles. Rumors then spread to the South about what they were doing. They came in overwhelmingly high numbers that had towered over the number of Northerners. This pro-slavery forces had then won the election. Less than two-thirds of voters were not registered citizens. Soon after the election had taken place, once again, the pro-slavery had won. Only 791 votes out of thousands had been cast anti-slavery. Many Missourians or border ruffians poured into Kansas to make sure the outcome was pro-slavery. The border ruffians were Missourians who came pouring into the Kansas territory and voted for Kansas to become a pro-slavery state. This is unfair and ridiculous in my opinion. I do not think it is okay for the Southerners to take away the land that has already been claimed free as an earlier compromise. They then created the bogus laws, as we called them. They were very strict punishments on anyone who spoke out against slavery or tried to aid a slave. I was completely outraged. We had then set up our own free state legislature in Topeka. The only problem was now there was two legislatures that outlawed each other. I don't care much for that though, because the slaves deserve to be free and that law goes against the First Amendment as well. The tension began to increase as the two factions struggled for control of the territory. In April 1856, the three congressmen looked into the troubles of Kansas. The committee had recognized the elections as fraudulent and said that the majority appeared to be anti-slavery. The federal government refused to follow its recommendations and continued to recognize the pro-slavery legislature as the legitimate government of Kansas. This angered me very much. There had been many violent attacks during this time period. Generally, these fights had been between our people and their people. In other words, pro-slavery versus the free statesmen. There had been instances of people who were tarred and feathered, kidnapped, and killed. The violence had soon escalated to when John Brown retaliated a group of pro-slavery men who had entered Lawrence. They burned the Free State Hotel, destroyed 2 printing presses, and ransacked homes and stores. I think that they deserved it, though. The violence had not stopped there. I had admired Charles Sumner in his speech against slavery, and was disappointed when someone attacked him over it. In September of 1856, a new territorial governor, John W. Greary, arrived in Kansas and began to restore order. The last major outbreak of violence was the Marias de Ciñez massacre, in which border ruffians killed 5 free statesmen. In all, approximately 55 people died in Bleeding, Kansas. I think that Bleeding, Kansas was an outrage, and that Kansas should continue on as a free state, as it did initially.
Thanks, Hannah, and now a word from our Southern commentator, Jason.
Thanks, Jess. In March of 1855, the travesty known as Bleeding Kansas unfortunately happened. It was caused by Northern abolitionists trying to have Kansas entered into the Union as a free state. Though legally introduced as a slave state, the Northerners felt that the state should be free, therefore going against the will of the government. The Northern settlers were very hostile to the Southern newcomers in Kansas. Even having a minister called Henry Ward Beecher gave weapons, which were called Beecher Bibles, to the settlers. In November of 1854, the vote for Kansas being free or slave occurred, with the population desperately calling for slavery. On March 30th of 1855, the vote for members of the territorial legislature occurred. Once again, the vote for slavery was overwhelming, with only 791 ballots out of 6,307 being against slavery. The newly elected legislature then passed the bogus laws, as the Northerners called it. These new laws brought the Missouri Slave Code into the area. To be sure that the laws would not be trampled on, the state government made rowdy abolitionists either be put to death or have 10 years of labor. Trying to create more chaos and anarchy, the Northerners set up a state legislature in Topeka, which the federal government justly ignored. Even with the new laws, the Northerners were still a hazard. A senator from Missouri, David Atchison, called out for the people of Kansas, ushering them to defend their home, quote, with the bayonet or blood, end quote. He even ordered them to kill every goddamned abolitionist in the district. On March 21st, 1856, the pro-slavers entered Lawrence and burned the Free State Hotel and destroyed 2 printing presses and took abolitionist supplies. The brute, John Brown, led retaliation at Pottawatomie Creek and then appeared at Oshawatomis and joined the fighting. Altogether, 55 people died as a result of this tragedy. As people can see, the abolitionists are to blame for all of these unfortunate deaths.
Thanks, Jason. We'll be back after this.
Go.
Hey, Hannah.
Hey, Natalie.
Wow, your sweatshirt's really soft.
The threads from Ferris Wheel Cotton Industry.
Wow, I have to get me some of that.
The best on this side of the Mississippi.
Do you want to get rich?
Do you want a better future for your family?
Then head west to California, where everyone's finding success. Here's an example.
Sweet Jesus, I found gold!
Hurry up and pack up your gear before all the gold runs out.
Welcome back.
Now let's head over to Kansas for an interview with John
Thanks,
Brown.
Natalie and Jess. Today we're here for an exclusive interview with John Brown. So, John Brown, how are you today?
I'm alright, how about you?
I'm doing fine. Why were you in Kansas?
I was there in order to remove the violent pro-slavery men from Kansas.
Why would you want to do that?
These pro-slavery men burned the Free State Hotel, destroyed 2 printing presses, and ransacked homes and stores. This was unacceptable.
How did you proceed to show that they weren't welcome in Kansas?
I arranged for a group of men, including myself, to attack at Potawatomi Creek.
Who did this grouping consist of?
These men included 4 of my sons, among a pack of other brave fighters.
Was this a violent attack?
That is no matter. It was necessary to remove the slaveholders from Kansas.
Were any people harmed during this retaliation, or was it more to scare the population?
Death wasn't our goal, but we couldn't let anyone stand in our way. 5 men were dragged from their homes and hacked to death.
Is this the only time you fought for what you believed in?
No, not long after I joined the fighting in Osawatomie.
What was that like?
I had the same motivation as in my last skirmish. It was necessary for the advancement of the country.
Alright, well that's all the time we have. Thank you for joining us, John Brown.
Thank you for having me.
Back to you, Natalie and Jess.
Thanks, Hannah. And now, watch out, Americans, there's a new party in town. And get this, they're calling themselves Republicans. According to Horace Greeley of a New York newspaper, the name was chosen because, quote, we think some simple name like Republican would more fitly designate those who had united to restore the Union to its true mission of liberty rather than of slavery, end quote. Even though most of us had only heard from them in this past 1856 election, the passionate feelings of those Republicans have been building up since the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Apparently, Horace Greeley and many other Northerners, like Salmon Chase and Charles Sumner, were angered over this act because it went against the Missouri Compromise of 1820. To those Northerners, the compromise was sacred because it guaranteed that slavery would not be permitted above the 36th degree 30 parallel. However, once the act was passed, settlers had the option of bringing slavery into the territory. Resulting from this, in January 1854, Northern leaders released what they called the Appeal of Independent Democrats in the Cincinnati Gazette. In this article, writers S.P. Chase, Charles Sumner, J.R. Goodings, Edward Wade, Garrett Smith, and Alexander DeWitt stressed that pro-slavery forces were a sign of imminent danger to the Union. The article was reprinted in several Northern newspapers, and following its publication was the first Republican Party meeting, which took place in Ripon, Wisconsin in 1854. Later in 1854, on June 6, 10,000 people turned out for another meeting near Jackson, Michigan. Known as Under the Oaks, this meeting led to the first Republican Organizing Convention in Pittsburgh on February 22, 1856. The party's first nominating convention took place in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania on June 17, 1856, which announced the birth of the Republican Party as a single force. Later that year, the Republican Party launched their first candidate for president, John C. Fremont, who won 11 out of the 16 northern states.
As you can see, throughout the past few years, there has been a roller coaster of controversy over slavery.
Hopefully, our country can come to an agreement over the dangerous issues that could separate the nation. We will be sure to keep you updated.
Thank you for watching, and a special thanks to Jason and Hannah for their opinions on Bleeding Kansas. From all of us here at Ferris News Network, I'm Natalie.
And I'm Jessica, and have a wonderful rest of your day.